Recording have started.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, the first topic that you will find in the next unit that you have, mainly after inequality, is institutions. And the most important institution, of course, we know is our democracy. So the first topic that you have is determinants of democracy. Huge amount of work has taken place on what determines or what are the determinants of democracy for any economy. And of course, it is very much closely related to economic development. I will just go through how do I teach this section is I have decided to do a brief literature review on the people on scholars who have worked on determinants of democracy so that you get a fair idea about what it is all about. Okay. Now what essentially what do we এটা কোথায় গেল? Just give me a second. Yeah. Yes. So what is essentially democracy? Democracy is nothing but an expansion of political freedom, an expansion of the concept of what we called political freedom. So democracy basically is political freedom. An expansion of political freedom means more and more democracy in a country. This can have, it does not essentially imply that if an economy is democratic in nature, it will always result in an increase in economic growth. Okay. It can have, according to what the literature is telling us, it can have opposing effects on economic growth too. It can have opposing effects on economic growth too. On economic growth too. Now, if I look at the positive side, if I look at the positive angle, what we find is that democratic institutions, that is when we look at the favorable impact of democracy on economic growth, we find that democratic institutions usually provide a check on governmental powers. Okay. So government will not be able to really exploit whatever or misuse whatever powers it has, and thereby it limits the potential of the public officials to amass greater and greater personal wealth and carry out policies which are not conducive to the overall good of the economy, overall common mass. Okay. So whenever you find that they are not taking populist policies, you will find that after 5 years that government is no longer in power, they are voted out. Of course, this has also got its bad side, because on the negative side, you will find that governments will be just the other side of the coin. The governments are more focused on concentrating too much on populist policies, and because what they need is just some votes to come back to power, and hence giving I mean throwing all sort of economic caution to the wind. They go about continuing with those economic policies, and that does not generally result in good effect on the economic growth. Okay. So we have, I'm not going to go into political examples, ample examples all around you, where you can see how populist policies are just throwing caution to the wind and going about with their populist policies for votes. Okay. So more democracy encourages one thing, that is rich to poor redistribution of income, and that can enhance the power of the interest groups. Okay. So on one hand, we are having, I am repeating this once more. On one hand, democratic institutions can provide a check on the governmental power. And once governmental power is checked, it can limit the potential of the public officials to amass personal wealth and carry out policies which are not very much popular in that regard. On the negative side, we find more democracy encouraging a redistribution of wealth and income from rich to poor, and that in fact, what is the negative impact of that? That can enhance the power of certain interest groups. So then you can ask me, so ma'am, in one line, what is the net effect of democracy on growth? It is still undecided, uncertain. It is just like the Kuznets hypothesis and the inequality thing. We are not very sure. Many scholars have come up with opposing results. So we cannot say for certain whether democracy is good for economic growth or not. That we cannot say with certain. So the net effect of democracy on growth is very, very uncertain. Okay. Now, there has been, as I said, I will be summarizing certain literature. So many people have worked on this, mainly empirical work. Obviously, if I want to find out whether democracy is good for economic growth or not, the most important way of finding that out is to go for cross-country empirical work. Okay, and a very good work has been done by a very famous economist, macroeconomist. You know him. You have studied. You might have studied his books. Barrow, Robert Barrow. Okay, of Harvard University. So he finds a non-linear effect of democracy on growth, which is not very much linear in nature. He have taken the various cross-country data to do this work. Okay, but he finds a non-linear effect of democracy on growth. I don't remember in which journal that paper was published, but 2 years after that, in 1999, he publishes a work on the similar lines in the Journal of Political Economy. Okay, so that is a much more broader work of Barrow in terms of democracy. Now, according to Barrow's work, the 1997 work that Barrow does, he focuses on the fact that if he takes uh, democracy to be the index of electoral rights. So he takes a very, very simplistic version of the concept of democracy. He considers it as how much electoral rights is given in a country. So the more it is given, the more democratic that country is. Okay. And he finds, using that index of electoral rights, he finds that growth is initially rising in an index of electoral rights, but he finds that the relation turns negative once a moderate amount of rights has been attained. So once a country is slowly democratizing, in those type of economies, it has been found out that growth has been initially rising, and after a certain point of time, growth suddenly turns negative once that economy attains a moderate amount of democratic rights. Am I audible to all of you? Am I there in the class?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, at times do respond, though I'm going for a lecture, because if I go out of the class, I don't understand that I'm out of the class. Okay. So that means what? So if I take this sentence which Barrow gives us through his empirical study, we can interpret that result as that in the worst dictatorships, suppose there are a country which has got worst dictatorships, any increase in democracy will stimulate growth in those economies. That's what I said, that given the index of electoral rights increasing, the economy grows. So suppose an economy starts with the concept of worst dictatorship, it is having worst dictatorship. As democracy rises, growth is stimulated in those type of economy, because the benefit from limitations on governmental power is a key matter. Okay, so here, as more and more people have say in the affairs, everyday affairs, so obviously growth will take a positive turn. But in places that have already achieved a moderate amount of democracy, okay, moderate amount of democracy is already achieved in various countries. If you go for more and more democracy in that country, that might impair growth to a certain extent, because the dominant effect comes from the social programs and redistribution of resources that takes place in those economy. And because people are more concerned with getting more and more of electoral rights and doing something with those electoral rights, so it can be taken in the negative way, in the case that the governments are more concerned with social programs which helps in the redistribution of resources. Again, I'm saying you have plenty of examples around you, and you can understand what exactly what Barrow had predicted is exactly happening in economies where there is more and more of democracy, more and more of electoral rights. The political parties, the government, the state, they are more concerned with social programs that helps in the redistribution of resources. So growth is given, I mean, growth is not given that sort of an importance. Rather, these things are given more importance, not for the sake of those people being increasing their well-being, but just for the heck of the fact that they are going to get votes, and which in turn will be translated into seats in the long run. Is it okay till here? Is Barrow's analysis fine till here?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, now so the impact of economic development on a country's propensity to experience democracy. Let us look at it from this view, the next part. That is, what is the impact of economic development? Let me just write this down. What is the impact of economic development on our country's propensity to experience democracy? Now, what are the work that has been done on this arena? What is the work that has been done in this arena? Now, Lipset is basically a political scientist. He's not an economist as such. He publishes in the annual Political Science Review in 1959. Now, Lipset talks about some social requisites of democracy, economic development, and political legitimacy. Now, according to Lipset, and it's a very, very commonly endorsed view in the arena of economic governance, that propensity stimulates democracy. So he says that the more and more prosperous a country is, I'm sorry, prosperity stimulates democracy. More and more prosperous a country is, the more democratic that country is supposed to be, or would want to be, would have more propensity to experience democracy. So, so what is his main work? His main work is prosperity stimulates democracy. This is Lipset's idea. And this idea is also sometimes in the economic governance cycles, it is also called Lipset hypothesis. Lipset hypothesis. Now, Lipset is fair enough, just like Amartya Sen did with the capability approach, that he really credits the capability approach that he builds upon to Aristotle. So similarly, Lipset, he also credits this whole idea of the Lipset hypothesis to Aristotle himself. Okay, so this is also credited to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle tells that if we look at the human society, that is say from Aristotle down to the present situation, everyone have basically argued that only in a wealthy society in which there are relatively few citizens lived in real poverty, so very few people live in real poverty, could a situation exist in which the mass of the population could intelligently participate in politics and could develop the self-restraint necessary to avoid succumbing to the appeals of irresponsible demagogues, right? So this is, I just read it out from one of Aristotle's books, Aristotle's papers. You will find some of Aristotle's papers on democracy in the internet. So there you will find, so he very, and many people endorses this view of Aristotle. We say that for a democracy to function properly, the way that we would want any democracy to function, it is very, very important that the mass of the population should be intelligent enough to participate in politics. Okay, so that they are not swayed by demagogues, so that they are not swayed also by populist policies of the state. Okay. So this is what we call as Lipset hypothesis. So it's from time immemorial, whenever we have prosperity in an economy, prosperity will always stimulate democracy. Now, Lipset emphasized also certain other facts. He emphasized increased education, because you need a literate mass. And he also, another thing, prosperity does not always mean uh, it does not always mean emergence of rich and richer people. It also emphasizes the fact that whenever a society is prosperous, it does not mean that there's a large proportion of people who are rich, but that there's a large proportion of people who are in the middle class. So you need to have an enlarged middle class as key elements, okay, to promote democracy, as key elements to promote democracy. Now, I'm tempted to say so many things and so many examples, but I cannot. That is, I hope these are certain hypotheses and theories which today's party people or political parties have not gone through. That what is more important is not only just putting money, only money, in the hands of the people in various possible ways, but to create employment opportunities such that an enlarged middle class can emerge. And that is a key element to promote democracy. But of course, if you go the other way around, you can rely on illiterate mass who can be swayed by your demagogue, and then you can have power in your hands. So that is another way out. Okay. The other checks on the government powers obviously are private organizations and institutions, which are important as checks on the centralized government power. Okay. Now, again, apart from Lipset, he talks about this. There is another man, very, very famous man. He is not a political scientist. Rather, I think Robert Putnam is a sociologist, if I'm not wrong. He might be a political, but he's not an economist. Okay. Robert Putnam, he in economics, he does his name crops up in various areas, mainly in the area of social capital research. Mainly in the area of social capital research, his name crops up. Now, Robert Putnam, he argues that he has a very famous work, very famous book. In 1993, he writes on making democracy work. Making democracy work. Civic traditions in modern Italy. So in this book, he talks about social capital, and on terms of social capital, he talks about how the propensity for civic activity is the key, what should I say, is the key thing for good governance. He talks about Italy, but of course it can be talked for overall for the world as such, all regions of the world as such. So he talks about, Putnam argues that propensity for civic authority, propensity for civic activity is the key underpinning of good governance, of good governments. So to make democracy really work, what you essentially require is civic activities. More and more people engaged in more and more of civic activities. And also there is another famous man who works on this, Huber Rueschmeier and Stephens. They have a single book. Huber, Rueschmeier, and Stephens, they have a single paper in, again, the Journal of Economic Perspectives. Perspectives. It's a 1993 paper which focuses on the crucial concept that capitalist development lowers the power of the landlord class and raises the power and ability to organize in the working and the middle class. So he says that uh, whenever you will have capitalist development in an economy, the power of the landlord class will gradually go down, and working and the middle class, their power, their ability to organize themselves and form a major class in the society emerges. Okay, so this is their view on economic development and democracy. So obviously it is promoting democracy. So more and more of capitalist development, obviously according to Huber et al, it is promoting democracy. Okay, so what did they say? I'll just write that down. Capitalist development lowers the power of the landlord class and raises the power and ability to organize of the working and middle income classes. Now, is it okay till here? So I talk about
Yes.
Lipset, I talk about Putnam, I talk about Huber et al. Okay. And next is in certain other work, in some models, it has been found out that an autocrat, who is an autocrat, he would voluntarily relinquish some authority by empowering a legislature or by establishing a constitution, by expanding the voting rights and extending the civil liberties in order to deter revolution. Okay, and to encourage the private sector to invest. This is a very, very interesting fact. So I have other scholars, many other scholars, they are of this view. This is interesting. Many other scholars, they are of the view that if there is any autocrat and if he really wants, if he really does not want to relinquish his total authority, so what he is doing, he is ready to give up some of his authority. Okay, to so that revolution does not take place. Okay, and private sector are encouraged to invest in that economy. Okay, so and if then of course you can ask me, ma'am, what is the reason that why does he want the private sector to invest? Because the more and more private sector invests, so since he's part of the government, he's an autocrat, he has got the power to tax, so that expands the pie, that expands a cake on which he can tax, right? So he also wants the private sector to come and play its role. So this is in many economies, you will find this, that, and many other scholars agree that.
Ma'am,
Yes.
ma'am,
Yes.
but if it allows, if the autocrat allows the private enterprise to come and invest,
Mhm.
ma'am, will not there be a clash with the autocrat's interests? Because then to the state versus that state versus business, that debate will come, and again the gradually the business will, like the business sector will try to evade, because there is an autocrat with the mass support. It will try to evade, and the possibility of revolutions are going to increase, like what happened, though it was like in the pre-modern era. Even if we take classical examples of even the East India Company, though it's a very uh, like like in the pre
Mhm.
like just say in the end of the medieval period,
Mhm.
but still, ma'am, the East India Company also came as businessmen at a time when the
Mhm.
emperor
So
was the
that
autocrat. There's no democracy.
exactly what you are saying, trying to say is that that is the pathway by which democracy is born. Okay, whenever an autocrat is in a very static state, if you try to think it in that way, he has got no other avenues to really increase his worth. Okay, so slowly and slowly he has to relinquish some of his power to bring in, to get more revenue, which the East India Company also did, according to your example. Okay, and so that gave way to revolution, and that gave way to democracy. So that's a pathway of democratic development. That's a pathway how democracies are born. That's one of the major pathway. But then you can say that then I remain an autocrat and I don't do all these things. So then you remain a static, in a very static state where you don't see any sort of improvement coming your way. Okay.
In North Korea is a very typical example.
So you stay there, you don't budge from that position. But human psychology is something which is very much complicated to understand, right? Because we are never content in whatever state we are. So obviously all autocrats would go the same way, most of them would go the same way, and that's how we have democracies all over. Very good example, very good example. Okay. Many other scholars agree that an autocrat would voluntarily relinquish some of his authority in whatever ways, and in order to deter revolution. But if he keeps the power in his own hand, so that again will result in revolution more sooner than later. But if he relinquishes his authority, maybe the revolution would take place, but at a much more later stage. That is also another point. Okay. Another interesting work was by Peter Boone. Peter Boone, his work is in 1996. He writes a book on political and gender oppression. I think it's a London School of Economics book. Gender oppression as a cause of poverty. So Peter Boone, he also develops a model along the lines that that I talk about. Okay. And he determines that the equilibrium amount of freedom can be determined by considering the net benefits of oppression to the potential rulers. So how much how much of oppression the potential rulers are having on their followers, on the citizens of that economy. So they want to they construct a model where that equilibrium amount of freedom, they calculate that equilibrium amount of freedom from that model. So but again and again, I'm telling you again and again, we do not come into any sort of clear cut result here. Also Boone also comes out with a very ambiguous result. Very ambiguous result. So he gives an example that an increase in human capital will raise the people's ability to resist oppression, but at the same time it also raises the rulers' benefits from subjugating them. So if you educate more people, if you skill more people, obviously they will try to revolt, because now they understand that they are being oppressed. On the other hand, if the ruler is capable of subjugating them, then the amount of benefit that those good human capital can give you is enormous. So obviously, if you can build a model where you can put forth the constraining factors, that on what factor will the ruler be able to subjugate them, then obviously the benefits that is obtained by the ruler is enormous. Okay, so you get, so again, hence, as I say, the result is quite ambiguous in nature. The equilibrium amount of freedom is determined by considering the net benefits of oppression to potential rulers. An increase in human capital raises the people's ability to resist oppression, but raises the ruler's benefits from subjugating them. Okay. Next, also another very, very important determinant that we usually have is urbanization. Because a rise in urbanization always makes it easier for people to meet and communicate. And that becomes very difficult to suppress those people. So you are meeting each other, you're communicating, you're exchanging your ideas. So it becomes very hard to suppress this kind of people. Again, it also makes it easier for an autocrat to monitor and control the activity. So you are in a very controlled area in an urban setting, and it is very easy to control you. So I cannot tell you any clear predictions from the theoretical models that has been developed and the cross-country evidence that has been examined, whether economic development is good for democracy or not. But some work done by Barrow essentially is confirming the Lipset hypothesis or the Aristotle hypothesis that if standard of living of a society really increases, this does really forecast a gradual rise in democracy. Okay. In contrast, when we look at economies or democracies that arises without any prior economic development, it can be because it was imposed by the colonial powers or some international organization. You will find those democracies tending not to last. Okay. So we can
Ma'am,
look
what
at
is written after but oppression, uh,
but
something the last
raises. I'm sorry.
raises.
Sorry. I write so fast. Raises the rulers benefits from subjugating them.
Okay, ma'am, thank you.
Okay. So you people will be doing some of your dissertation after this. So in your next semester. So this is another one idea. I gave you some ideas when we were doing inequality. I think if you can take this up also, this is another idea that how do you essentially measure democracy, and how can you check out if you do a cross country study, you can easily find out using simple panel data regression and things like that. You can try to find out whether democracy has an impact on economic development or not in your own small way. You can take some selected economies and check that out. Okay. So if you want to do that, the first thing that you really need to know is how do you measure democracy? How is democracy measured? So how you cannot just write that a country is democratic. We have to have a quantitative measurement. How is democracy measured? We need to have a quantitative measurement of democracy. So here, whatever I talked about democracy in till now in my class, till now, I have focused here mainly on the electoral aspect, or on the role of elections, or if I talk about the role of elections. Okay. Then there is a man, another man, Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington, 1991 paper was a book, the third wave. It's not the third wave of COVID, but it is a third wave democratization in the late 20th century. In the whole world, if we study democracy properly from the political science views, you will find that democratization in the world have come up in waves. Okay. So this, we are talking about the third wave democratization in the late 20th century. He says that the central procedure of democracy is the selection of leaders through competitive elections by the people they govern. So this is exactly how democracy is defined by Huntington. That is, the central procedure of democracy is nothing but selection of leaders through competitive elections by the people they govern. And Schumpeter, Schumpeter we had in economics, he also talks about democracy when he says that the democratic method is a method in which institutional arrangements for arriving at political decisions and where individuals acquire power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's votes. Okay, so if you have to measure democracy, you have to measure the electoral rights. That is well understood. So if I have to measure democracy, I cannot measure democracy just like that. That has to be done by using the indicator of electoral rights. Now, there is a person called Gastill. Gastill compiles this index, Gastill. You can search him, Gastill, Raymond Gastill. Raymond Gastill. And there is a survey of freedom. Democracy means there is a comparative survey of freedom, and in that survey Gastill builds up an index. Okay, and they use the concept of electoral rights using very narrow definition. So political rights, what are political rights? They are the rights to participate meaningfully in the political process. In a democracy, this means the right of all adults to vote and compete for public office and for elected representatives to have a decisive vote on public policies. Okay, so I'm an adult, I should have the right to vote and also to right to stand as a candidate to be elected, to be a representative of the people. The This looks less democratic because everybody is not involved, but it's very much clear also that even if we consider this as the definition of democracy, then there can be various minority parties who will not have any influence on any public policies formed. So that also is a part of the thing. But again, you can explain the fact that the people did not give them votes and hence they are in a minority. Okay, there is a survey by the Freedom House. They apply this. Gastill, he is associated with this Freedom House. They apply the concept of electoral rights on a subjective basis to classify countries, and annual reports comes out into 7 categories. Group 1 is the highest level of rights. Group 1 is the highest level of rights. Group 7 is the lowest level. So this is made by Gastill, as I've already told you, and he uses the published and unpublished information about each country. Okay. Now, the original ranking I said is group 1, and then there is group 7, group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This original ranking from 1 to 7 was then converted to a scale from 0 to 1. After that, they convert it into a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 denotes fewest rights. That means which rank? Group 7, right?
7, yes.
And 1 denotes most rights. Most rights. And this is related to Gastill's group 1. Is it fine? Is it understood till here?
Yes.
Have I exceeded my time? What is the time?
No, 47.
Then I stop here.
Ma'am, what kind of questions can come from this part?
Huh? What?
What kind of questions can come from this part?
I will take one more class, Dia, here on this, and I will tell you what type of questions also can come in the last class. So let me just see how much I can proceed.
Yes.